I would like to welcome Dr. Jennifer Stern of NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, and she is going to be talking about the present is the key to the past, using modern measurements to reveal ancient Mars. Welcome, Dr. Stern.
Thank you. Do we have any geologists in the room? Okay, good. So I am actually a geologist, although I forget that sometimes because so much of what we do on Mars is interdisciplinary. I call myself an astrobiologist, a biogeochemist, a stable isotope geochemist, but really it kind of all comes back to geology. And in geology, it all comes back to this concept that the present is the key to the past. And this is actually sort of the fundamental axiom of geology. It was originally stated by, I think, James Hutton, and then wordsmithed by Charles Lyell, who is described as being a British lawyer and a foremost geologist. So who knew those two things went together? But what's interesting is that we understand Earth because of the processes we see on the surface of Earth today. And what this axiom, the present is the key to the past, actually means is that we can look at the processes occurring today at waves crashing on a beach, or at mountain streams, or glaciers abrading against a mountain. And we can look in the rock record, we can look at the rocks in the landscape and see that these rocks were formed by the actual processes we see today. And so this seems kind of obvious today, but in the past it was not so obvious. And I bring it up now because we understand Mars only because we understand the link between the processes we see on Earth and the way they're recorded in the geological record on Earth. So, to understand Mars, we really need to understand how processes such as biology, geology, chemistry, and physical processes are recorded on Earth. This is how we can go to Mars, either as humans or rovers or orbiting, and try to understand what we actually see. It's because we understand the links between the rocks we see and the processes that created them. And so on Earth, to this end, we do things like Mars analog research. We go to places like Hawaii, where there is basaltic volcanism, and we look at the gases that are coming out of the magma and of the vents. And we can try to understand what the hazards might be. And we also understand what the composition of these rocks are and whether there's feedstock for life. We go to places in the Arctic, and we look at the processes of cold weathering, basically weathering of ice and not flowing water, to try to understand whether what we see on Mars was weathering by a lot of water or by ice. And we also go places like Australia, where you have very acidic, you can have acidic playa lakes, and we try to understand what it looks like when we have sediments that were laying down in a neutral, habitable environment versus a very acidic or dry environment. So we go to places on Earth that are Mars-like to try to understand what we see on Mars. And because we've done this, we can interpret what we see on the surface of Mars. And here are a few examples that I'm sure you're familiar with. Ever since we've been able to see Mars through telescopes, we've seen that water has marked the surface. And whether initially, way back when they thought they were canals, or later when we can see that these are large gullies, large valleys, canyons formed by water, we were able to see that simply from Earth. We also know, now that we can orbit Mars and now that we can go to Mars and look at the mineralogy, that we have sedimentary rocks on Mars. And these are formed in the presence of water, some of these. And then we have something like gypsum, which is called an evaporite, and it forms when water evaporates. We have water-bearing clays, and we know that there's water ice because on Phoenix we were able to trench and scrape and get under the initial layers of sediments and see water ice. So all of this information we interpret through the context of what we know on Earth. Now there's a couple special things about Mars, and there's a couple special things that serve as ciphers or keys to the Martian past. One of these is the Martian atmosphere. In the present Martian atmosphere actually holds keys to what happened to the atmosphere, to how the atmosphere changed over time. So this is a pretty cool thing, and this is something that we are currently measuring on the surface of Mars with Curiosity and the Sample Analysis at Mars suite. And then also, rocks and sediments on Mars, unlike on Earth, have been fairly unaltered for billions of years. On Earth, we have plate tectonics. We actually we erase the record of our past. But on Mars, this is all there. And so we can go to these rocks and we can actually see what was going on billions of years ago in the atmosphere and in the environment. And we know what we know about Mars through this robust Mars exploration that we've had, starting with Martian meteorites. And Martian meteorites are very unique and very precious because they are the only actual physical pieces of Mars that we currently have right now that we can take and use modern instrumentation in our labs, most cutting edge stuff, and analyze these things. And then of course we can look at Mars from Earth. We have orbiters, we have landed missions from Viking to Curiosity, which Pan just spoke about and I will speak more about. And then of course, the idea of being able to put a geologist on the ground on Mars and able to make measurements and look at things in geological context the way we do on Earth is a pretty amazing thought. So I'm not going to go into detail about the Mars Science Laboratory. This is what Pan just spoke about. But I am going to talk a little bit more about one instrument that both Pan and I work on the rover, which is called Sample Analysis at Mars. And this is a great instrument. It actually represents a full analytical lab in the belly of the Mars rover. And so Curiosity is out there to assess how habitable an environment is and to understand what the role of water and what surface radiation and what are the things that make Mars habitable today or in the past. And so SAM contributes to this by measuring volatile species in the atmosphere, so atmospheric gases and gases released from rocks. When we heat rocks, they release gases, and this tells us something about their formation and what they contain. We also look for organic molecules. And then finally, we have the unique capability to make very precise measurements of isotopic composition, and this includes the ability to discriminate between carbon dioxide made with carbon-12 versus carbon-13. We can also make very, very precise measurements of methane. So it's a whole analytical laboratory. It's actually 3 main pieces with lots of other pieces that help us out. The Quadrupole mass spectrometer is up there on your left, and that was built at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, not too far from here. The gas chromatograph, which is actually 6 columns that serve to separate compounds before we look at them and we identify them by their masses, was built in France, the French space agency. And then the tunable laser spectrometer, which measures very precisely methane and the isotopic composition of CO2 and water, was built at JPL. So we bring all these instruments together and we provide, we also have ovens that heat the samples up. We have a pump, everything is being pumped, so we actually evacuate all of the manifolds before we analyze a sample. So it's really like having an actual lab on the surface of Mars. And this is a little bit, this is a little more detailed, this is what it looks like. You may have seen in the first picture of it, it's about the size of a large microwave oven. So all of this capability in a laboratory on Earth would fill up half a room at least. So the fact that we're able to shrink it down to what in spaceflight is actually considered kind of a big instrument, it's still an amazing amount of capability in a very small package. And what's amazing also is that it works. We got to the surface, we turned it on, we've been able to make wonderful measurements from the beginning of the mission, and it's been extremely exciting to be involved in this. So a little bit more about how SAM helps us with this idea of the present, measuring the present as the key to the past. We measure the atmosphere, and we measure volatiles evolved from samples. And 3 of the questions I'm going to address and tell you a little bit about the results, recent results from the mission, are how has the Martian atmosphere changed over time? As Pan mentioned, we know at one point Mars had an atmosphere, and then it was lost. The magnetic field retained the atmosphere, and then at some point we no longer had that, atmosphere was stripped, An atmosphere is really crucial to be able to sustain water on the surface and to have life. So what was the role of water on Mars? When was it there? When did it leave? And then were there nutrients there in a form that would have been available for biology? So nutrients, things like carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, they can be there. They may exist, but it's really important what form they exist in. Are they available for uptake by biology, by life? Because you can have nitrogen, carbon, sulfur, all of these things that life uses, but if they're locked into molecular forms that life can't get at, and there's no way to get at them, then they're not a resource anymore. So to start trying to understand how the atmosphere changed on Mars over time, we have to understand where gases come from in the first place on Mars. And so on any planetary body, as a planetary body cools, you have gases coming out of the center of the planet. You have outgassing. On Earth and on Mars, we had volcanism. Now, volcanism has not been present on Mars for millions to billions of years, but at one time, there was gas release. You had exchange between fluids that were in the crust and in the atmosphere. Now you pretty much have direct sublimation. You go from ice to water vapor. And then you also have the moving around of gases on the surface into polar ice caps. So we have dry ice caps and we have water ice caps. But also what's kind of unique about Mars, if we're comparing Earth to Mars, is that Mars has this large atmospheric escape. So if you look at the arrow that goes out the top, you have the escape of atmosphere. And this is a very important process that shaped Mars as we know it today. So how does the atmosphere actually record this loss of atmosphere? Well, this is when we get to isotopes, which are usually a difficult concept to explain to a general audience, and even sometimes isotopes confuse me, even though I'm an isotope geochemist. But it goes back to the idea that there are heavy and light molecules. And what you have, for example, with hydrogen is the most simple case. Hydrogen is one proton, and deuterium is hydrogen with one proton and one neutron. And so it's heavy. So you have one species that's heavier than the other. And what you have with any process is usually processes are based on a budget of energy. And bonds are made and broken with the least energy. And so what you have is you have a loss of the light stuff, the light molecules, the light version of hydrogen, the light version of carbon, light version of nitrogen. This is what gets lost out the top of the atmosphere. And then you leave the rest of the atmosphere with the heavy version of that molecule. So we look at the ratio of the heavy to the light stuff in order to get an idea of how much has been lost over time. So I'm going to give you the first example is of carbon. And so what you see here is down is light, up is heavy. And the notation on the side is basically a notation used by earth scientists. If you imagine that 0 is sort of where we start, and if you look at bulk carbonaceous chondrite, which is basically meteoritic carbon, and meteorites represent sort of what the birth of the solar system. So what did we start with? We think of this as the starting point. On Earth, we have an atmosphere that's not too much changed from the bulk carbon. But in the rocks, we have carbon that is light. And actually, this is because biology prefers light carbon. And most of carbon on Earth, the bulk of carbon is light. So you see this very light carbon on Earth. If you look at Mars and the carbon in Mars meteorites, you see that it's above 0. It's heavy. And this is because of that loss. This is because that C12, that CO2 made of C12, has been lost out of the top of the atmosphere. And so the remaining carbon in the atmosphere is heavy. And we see this in meteorites. We see this in the measurements that we make on the surface of Mars today. So space scientists and geologists look at things a little differently. And in this graph, heavier is down. And what we're looking at here is the ratio of argon-36, which is lighter, to argon-38. And so if you take a look at the sun and Jupiter, which represent primordial, unchanged, argon ratios. And then you take a look at Earth. They're all sort of about at the same place. But if we take a look at the most recent measurements by sample analysis at Mars, you see that Mars' atmosphere argon is heavier. Again, this is just like carbon, this is just like the CO2 case. You have the lighter stuff being lost, and the remaining atmosphere is full of the heavier species. So how do the rocks on Mars actually retain these records? So what we look at when we look at rocks with SAM, with sample analysis at Mars, is we looked at the tailings from drilled samples. And here are examples of where we actually have drilled. And I'm going to speak specifically about this Yellowknife Bay. It's called John Klein, this John Klein sample that we drilled and analyzed early in the mission. And so what you see here is a lot of lines. But what you see on the bottom is a sample temperature. So what SAM does is it heats a sample up, and then we measure the gases that come off with the mass spectrometer. Now, what I want to point out to you specifically is these red dots that represent water. So you have a lot of water coming off the sample at low temperature, and that's just water vapor that's been absorbed to the sample. But then we have this peak up here. Okay, and I also want to call attention to this oxygen, which comes from, Pan talked about the chlorinated oxidants in the soil, and so these produce oxygen when you heat them up. But we're going to focus in on this peak right here. And not only do we have evidence up here that we have this peak, but we have evidence from the X-ray diffraction tool CheMin, which is also in the analytical lab, on Mars Science Lab, that we have what's called dehydroxylation of a clay. So we have this detection of a phyllosilicate clay. And the reason that's important is because phyllosilicates have a very tight structure. So they're actually made with octahedral bonds, and the water in phyllosilicate is retained in the hydrogen that's locked up in these bonds. So all of this stuff in the middle, when you heat it up, it comes off at low temperature. That represents the lower temperature hump. But then all of these green molecules are locked up in the structure of the mineral. And when we heat the rock to a higher temperature, what we see is the water, the signature of the water that the mineral was originally formed in. And so what does this tell us? Again, we have, down is light, up is heavy. You have Earth water around 0. We have, if you take a look at the purple, we have modern Mars atmosphere. Again, much heavier because of this loss of atmosphere. And when we measured the water locked up in this clay, that's about 3 billion years old, what we see is something in between. So what we see is not as enriched, not as heavy, meaning these clays were around. When these clays were around, there was some atmosphere. The atmosphere had not all become lost to space yet. And so it's pretty exciting because it's a data point that we did not have before at about 3 billion years. And this is a little bit complicated to look at. This is from Geronimo Villanueva's paper, and he was here yesterday speaking about water on Mars. But the importance of this is that, if you can see, there's not a lot of dots on this plot. And we have dots at the beginning, so we kind of know what the beginning looks like in terms of water on Mars. We know that we believe there was water on Mars. And we have present day, where we have this very enriched atmosphere representing the loss. And now we have a data point in the middle to try to understand that at 3 billion years ago, there was some atmosphere. There was standing water on the surface. And thus, this gives us an idea that this was habitable environment. So water, atmosphere, and then finally, nutrients. One other detection that we made was the detection of nitric oxide released when we heated up the same rock. And this is from the thermal decomposition of nitrate. The significance of this is that nitrate is a form of fixed nitrogen. Now, as I mentioned before, nutrients may be present on Mars, but they might be in a form that you can't get at them, or that biology can't get at them. And nitrogen is a good example of that. So nitrogen is bonded together with a triple bond, and it's very energetically expensive to break that bond. But what we do find on Mars is that there is a way to do that in the absence of biology, and that's through photochemistry. So the amounts that we're measuring are quite small. They're much lower than even deserts on Earth. The Atacama Desert in Chile is often used as an analog for Mars because it's so arid. So we're seeing amounts that are about 0.1, 0.2 weight %. So it's very low, but it's there. And again, this is so important because this ability to get at nitrogen is so important to life that life evolved a way to get at it, and that's called metabolism. So metabolism on Earth evolved in order to break that triple bond and to make fixed nitrogen. This is the nitrogen cycle on Earth. It's very different than the one on Mars, or what we see on Mars, but what we see on Earth is that we have bacteria that break this bond, make ammonium, and then from that, we make nitrate. And then from nitrate, plants can uptake nitrate. So nitrate's actually it's very bioavailable. In fact, it's what is in commercial fertilizer. So the point of this is just to show that this is such an important process on Earth that life actually developed metabolism based around this requirement for nitrogen. On Mars, we see that it's fixed by photochemistry, and we know this because actually there is photochemically fixed nitrogen on Earth. And we do not have any evidence right now of any sort of biological processing of nitrogen, but it's important to note that had life existed, it had a source of chemically available nitrogen. So I just want to wrap up, give time for a few questions. I wanted to show you that we have to understand Earth in order to understand Mars. We have to understand how geology works on Earth and how to read the record of the rocks in the atmosphere. In particular, Mars's atmosphere holds keys to its past. And then, of course, because the surface of Mars has remained unaltered for so long, we're able to actually access a period of time in Martian history that we can't even access on Earth because it's been erased by plate tectonics. And then finally, the other part of the axiom, the present is the key to the past, is that the past is the key to the future. And that if our history as a species in space exploration is any indication, it won't be long before we are actually on Mars and exploring. And I want to acknowledge Mars Science Laboratory, Sample Analysis at Mars, NASA Goddard, and all of you for being here and all Mars enthusiasts. And here are some information about Curiosity and about sample analysis at Mars.
Would you care to comment on these merging models from Earth laboratories, but actually quite well confirmed by the data that's coming out of MSL, that life on Earth actually began on Mars and was later transported to Earth? Are you familiar with these?
Yes, it's just, I mean, that is one model for this. And I'm not familiar with all of the evidence for it. I mean, we know that there are, we know that there are amino acids and nucleobases in meteorites, and we know that there are things that from bombardment, the late heavy bombardment, we know that there was a lot of exchange because we have things hitting planets, stuff coming in from outside. I can't comment to that. I don't have a strong opinion on that.
Other than the trace amounts of methane you found, have we detected any trace amounts of any other organic compounds? And if so, what implication might that have?
So a paper was recently published in the Journal of Geophysical Research, I believe, on chlorobenzene, the detection of chlorobenzene. And we believe that carbon is Martian carbon. Or, I mean, it's hard to say because there's carbon on the surface of Mars from the influx of meteoritics. So we do know that we believe that the carbon is not anything we brought from Earth. We believe that it's something from Mars. So it's hard to say without knowing whether it's exogenously delivered carbon or in situ carbon, you know, what that says about the development of any organic chemistry on Mars. Yeah.
You mentioned nutrients, the macronutrients like carbon and nitrogen and sulfur are structural components of biological. There are also micronutrients like copper, zinc, and cobalt
Sure.
that you might find in metal ore deposits that, when you look at these evolved gases, can you speak to what's in the subsurface in terms of maybe layering of different sedimentary and then maybe volcanic rocks on top of each other, and how that might release gases to the atmosphere over time? And in terms of a source of nutrients like copper that might enable enzymes to function.
Right. Well, we are actually not the best detector for detecting things like copper, iron, heavy metals. That would be the alpha X-ray particle spectrometer. That would be several other things. However, I think the problem in getting that kind of history in layers is that we are not able to go down that deep and sort of get a really good history from our very small drilling in order to actually answer that question. But that's important because the active centers of a lot of enzymes are these metal cations. So that's an important question. I don't know.
Gillivan, you pointed out that biology concentrates the lighter isotope. You showed data, but all the data were of the atmosphere where the opposite effect occurs, as you pointed out. The only data you showed on solids was from Martian meteorites. Has curiosity not examined some of the regolith for that critical ratio of carbon?
We have.
What
And
is it?
So we've looked at carbon. In particular, there's published data for the rock nest, which is a scoop of carbon. It's a scoop of sediment. And it's actually a range. It goes into the positive, and it also goes into the negative. And but before you get too excited about that, Martian magmatic carbon and refractory carbon also has a negative isotope fractionation. Sure, absolutely. It does not, absolutely, it leaves the question open. But there needs to be more than isotopic evidence for life because there are inorganic processes that can fraction isotopes in a negative way. That's true. That's absolutely right. Sure, but it's one piece of evidence. You have to have more than just an isotopic fractionation. You need all of the surrounding evidence. You need biomolecules. You need certain assemblage of hydrocarbons. And we don't see that, at least right now.
All right, let's thank Dr. Stern again, and we'll move on.